Hello and welcome to this video, and this video is going to be called The Beatles, perhaps the greatest single influence on jazz fusion. Right, so that's obviously a bit of a clickbaity title, but I've been giving this a lot of thought, and I think it is perhaps the case that the Beatles are the single biggest influence on the creation of jazz fusion, and I'm going to argue why I think that is. So when we're looking at jazz fusion, we're looking at a fusion between jazz and rock music, of course. Now this is a troublesome thing to identify, because obviously if we go back to the origins of rock music, which is rock and roll, and we go and look at Chuck Berry and Little Richard and all those guys, that is really indebted to jazz. If you take the jazz out of Little Richard and Bill Haley and all that bit, you're not left with much, really. Rhythm and blues is something that came out of the big band era. If you go and listen back to Count Basie records in the 30s, they sound very much like rock and roll records. So if you take rock and roll, if you take the jazz out of rock and roll, what you're really left with is country music. Now if you go back to the historic 1927 recordings, where the groundworks of country music was really laid with Jimmy Rogers and the Carter family, you will see that there's jazz musicians on that as well, because even country music is a sort of fusion between, you know, American folk forms and the rhythm section of jazz. You know, it's like when you hear, listen to country records and the fact that they're swinging, you know, that swing feel has come from jazz. So it's very difficult when you start talking about what's actually going on with fusion. What fusion was the marrying of certain rock music styles that emerged in the 1960s with jazz. In the 1960s, pop and rock and roll changed. It suddenly became much more sophisticated. Bands started to emerge that were, there were psychedelic bands like Jefferson Airplane and the Grateful Dead and Love. There was bands like John Mayall's Blues Breakers, and Graham Bond and Brian Auger in the UK. And on what these people were doing, the reason why they'd been able to make rock and roll more sophisticated is because they were fusing that with jazz yet again, and also classical music and folk music. So these forms are going around and around. One of the things that the fusion musicians did is they fused it with a very particular aspect of rock music that had emerged in the 1960s. And that's a whole bunch of bands that they would have been listening to. So for example, Chick Corea has mentioned many a time that one of the reasons that he went to fusion was hearing Cream. And Cream's exploratory, improvisatory style on those albums showed him a way that jazz musicians could get involved in that rock sound. So Cream are very important. But of course, the most important band in the 60s for this sort of moving forward of rock from a sort of simple pop music form to a very highly sophisticated form has to be the Beatles. Okay? So I would argue that the Beatles' very presence in the music industry and the effect they had affected all forms of music, and it affected it in many different ways. And I want to go through some of those ways because there's many of them. Okay? So I think with the Beatles, what you've got is basically four guys that have really fallen in love with American rock and roll, with Chuck Berry and Little Richard. And they're playing a version of that, but it's an English version of that. So they're bringing in other influences into that music. And what they're bringing in is a sort of British music hall song structure. The cheeky chappy persona that made the Beatles, I think, very likeable when they first emerged, is really drawing from an English tradition of the music hall. So there's extra influences in there with the Beatles right from day one. And that's why when they're doing, shake it up baby now, shake it up baby now, when they're doing something like Twist and Shout, that of course is an American rhythm and blues track. But those extra influences are there. So I think that is the thing that makes the Beatles special. Before the Beatles came along, the United Kingdom had probably had a handful of number ones in America, and of course America is the home of pop music. If you're a pop star in America, then you're a worldwide pop star. And there'd been a few hit singles from the UK, but when the Beatles came along, they absolutely dominated that scene. They usurped every single American pop artist. You know, if you look in 1963, 64, the Beatles are occupying the first, second, third, fourth slot of the hit parade, Billboard hit parade. So the very nature of their huge success exerts an influence on the whole music industry. Now, the actual direct influence that happened on jazz, I think, is jazz is a tradition. Musicians are coming up all the time, and they're emerging, they're listening to the greats, they're studying them, they are assimilating all the techniques and approaches to jazz, which is a very sophisticated thing to do. There's a whole ton of young musicians emerging in the early 60s that are really studying jazz, but they are also get taken in by this huge phenomenon that is the Beatles, and that impresses them as well. Now, I think there's a whole generation of fusion drummers, for example, that I have spoken to that said they picked up the sticks when they saw the Beatles and Ringo Starr on the Ed Sullivan show. Now, Ringo in particular, right? And I may do a video on Ringo because I think this deserves a whole video, because there's, of course, on the internet a whole big argument going on between people who don't know anything about drumming, arguing that Ringo wasn't that good, right? Because they don't get it. Ringo was a very, very good musician, and I'm going to give you some proof as to why I think he was. The Beatles started off as a bunch of kids in Liverpool. They're not trained. They're not come from a sort of school musician. They're kids listening to music and just making music. They become very good because they hone their craft out in Hamburg, and that will make any band very good. Okay. So that's how they get good, but it's a sort of organic way that they've got good. They're so good that they get picked up by the labels. EMI signs them, puts them in the studio. But of course, when you go into the studio, the music is always sat on how good the drummer is. Every band is as good as their drummer. And for poor old Pete Best, when they get there, you know, George Martin turned around and said, well, this guy's not holding it down. Now, at that point, the Beatles had to go and find a drummer that could nail it in a major label studio playing live, right? So whoever they're going to get is going to be good. Now, Ringo is coming from a different angle. He's almost like a session player. He's not a guy that's just playing the Beatles. He's played a number of bands in Liverpool. And so he has the chops to come in and nail that session. That, for me, argues that Ringo, in a way, was perhaps the technically and artistically the most experienced musician in that band at that time. All right? Anybody knows about drumming will tell you that, you know, when you go into a recording studio and you have to nail it, that requires a whole bunch of virtuosity. Now, did Ringo then show off what he could do? No, because he developed the experience to learn how to play for the song. Oh my God, did he know how to play for the song? And he basically pioneered the way that you play for the song. Ringo played a huge part in creating the backbeat, the fat backbeat. Now that in itself goes on to influence a whole bunch of different music forms, from funk to soul to rock music and to jazz fusion. That in itself is a huge influence. But when Ringo appears on the Ed Sullivan show, he created an army of drummers who were going to pick up the sticks. And I'm sure this is the case for every single musician in that band, but I've got actual experience of talking to people. Like, I can tell two drummers I've had a conversation about this. One is Mark Schulman, who drums for Pink and is drummed for Cher, and Greg Bissonette, and both of them have said that when they saw that show, that made them pick up the sticks. And that influence is right there from day one. I think Vinnie Colaiuta is the same sort of thing. So there's a whole generation of later fusion musicians that in 1963-64 are starting to play because of Ringo. But musicians that are coming up in the 60s, now these are the people that really created fusion. they've also got an ear to the Beatles as well. And I think a very specific thing happens with the Beatles that really basically creates jazz fusion, right? Now, one of the things about jazz is sophisticated harmonically, but until the 1960s it's really working within a parameter, and that parameter is chord changes. Those chord changes are often based on musical songs or popular songs, or it's based on the blues. And those chord changes are expanded by the use of like the 2-5-1 progressions and the advancement and substitutions that you can derive from the 2-5-1. If you listen to something like Giant Steps is Coltrane's exploring the 2-5-1 or the 5-1 progression and trying to play that in 3 keys at once that are equally separated, to try and expand on the harmony. You know, in the 50s, musicians didn't know how to expand on the harmony. Miles Davis makes a breakthrough through listening to, I think, folk music from Guinea and from studying George Russell's concepts. He also develops a modal approach. So as we go into the 60s in jazz, the improvisation way of playing is changed. There's a push to expand on the harmonic form, which is to create freedom, which is going to end up with free jazz, and also to use modality, right? Now, as the Beatles emerge, one of the things that's really interesting with them is they are also messing with modal forms. I think of something like Norwegian Wood. So they're using modal forms in a song structure. Now, they're not doing that straight away. When they first emerged, they're basically playing American rhythm and blues, as I said, shot through with a whole bunch of English influences. But they start to progress. Now, what makes them progress? Well, there's a whole bunch of things that make them progress. The one artist I would say that really pushes them to do that is Bob Dylan. I would argue that Bob Dylan is also one of the great influences on jazz fusion. We know Miles was listening to Bob Dylan. We know Frank Zappa was listening to Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan's pushing the form. He's democratizing music. He's basically taking American folk music, but playing it in a way where anyone can now talk to the audience in that singer-songwriter style. He's also integrated that with electric instruments. I think that influence on the Beatles is huge. And I think because of the Beatles' popularity, the Beatles were able to take these techniques that they were developing through the 1960s and expand on them, right? Now, one of the things they did was change the way that song form works. Now, if you read interviews with them, this happened because of jazz, right? So there's a story I heard Paul McCartney tell where he used to go down to the local shop and there was a guitar teacher there and he was playing jazz standards, and they'd learned to play all the rock and roll, so they got the 3 chords going, but this guy was playing a B minor 7. Now, them in their sort of, I suppose, ignorance, went, oh my God, that's a cool chord. And they took that B minor 7 and then just started dropping it into their songs. And a lot of their early songs, that has this juice. This is a new thing in popular music, is the way that they will go in a direction harmonically in a pop song format that nobody's really done before. They did it in their own way. The old musical songwriters from which jazz stanzas were derived were very able, so they were using standards, almost like classical methods to navigate through, cadences, chord progressions, and all that type of stuff. What the Beatles would do would just throw in these crazy chords. Now, I've read interviews with Gary Burton. Now, Gary Burton is one of the most important musicians in the development of jazz fusion. So this is exactly the type of guy I'm talking about. This is someone who emerges in the 60s as a jazz virtuoso, but because of his age, he's also listening to rock music, and particularly the Beatles. And what he notices with the Beatles is the Beatles are playing different types of chords. And Gary Burton starts to write in a way which incorporates that writing process. And this really lays the foundations for jazz fusion. There's a certain way of approaching chords, which I called the chord scale method, that became the way of improvising in jazz fusion. So this is really like looking at the chord as though it's a thing in itself, and building not only arpeggios but scales. So you look at a D minor and you can say, well, that D minor I could use D Dorian, D Phrygian, I could use D Aeolian, I could use the second mode of the melodic minor. It's a chord scale approach to improvisation. And that's different to the way the beboppers would improvise, or the free jazzers, you know. Mix that with a bunch of modal jazz and we really have the harmonic foundations for jazz fusion. But also I think the Beatles were able to expand the form in itself, the way that they would use the recording studio, the way that they really single-handedly create the idea of the album. So the album's not just a collection of singles, which is how they start, but it's a statement within itself. So when we start to listen to what Miles is doing, you know, in the early 60s, Miles is making standard jazz records. There is a nod towards conceptualization. Kind of Blue is a concept album very loosely. So Miles is there already, you know. Now that's come from people like Frank Sinatra and their songbooks, you know, where they would create an album with a theme. But it's a bunch of songs tied together by a theme. What the Beatles did was actually create albums that were statements in themselves. Obviously the big one being Sgt. Pepper in 1967. Straight after that, you know, Miles starts to make things like In a Silent Way and Bitches Brew, which are huge statements in themselves. And in that, you're not going to buy it to listen to one track. If you buy Bitches Brew, you listen to the whole thing. It's a whole thing together, you know, and it has to be because some of the tracks are half an hour long. So that also creates the idea of creating the album, the use of studio experimentation, the expansion of not only using electric instruments. So you've got to remember the guitar is very important. And someone like Larry Coryell, who's also a Beatles fan, has grown up in the 1960s, and he's another originator of fusion, which doesn't get the credit he deserves. He is listening to the Beatles and playing guitar because the guitar suddenly become very important. Pat Metheny has said that, you know, he was a Beatles fan and he loved jazz, but he wanted to play the guitar because of the importance and stature that guitar had in rock music. Schofield has said this as well. So in my time of reading and listening to so many interviews with the guys that really created jazz fusion, it comes up over and over again. One influence gets mentioned over and over again. Anyone who's a fan of this channel will know that we're all big fans of John McLaughlin. John McLaughlin was working in the 60s in London, working with the musicians that were pioneering rock music. And the reason why London had become the centre of that, I think, is possibly because of the huge, massive worldwide success of the Beatles that had created a scene there. And was McLaughlin a Beatles fan? Yes. Every single time he mentions his influences, it's the Beatles, right? Right in there. So this is why I think the Beatles had such an influence on the creation of jazz rock fusion. They also had a huge influence on the creation of prog rock, and to some extent even, you know, things like heavy rock and art rock and all that type of stuff. I don't think this has really been mentioned that much, but I would say, and this is the point of this video, this is the statement I'm about to make, is that the Beatles are perhaps the greatest single influence on the development of jazz rock. Without what the Beatles did, and without all the music that hung off that, there would have been nothing to fuse with. Jazz fusion was not fusing with rock and roll, right? It was not fusing with the blues, because jazz is all of those forms. It's these extra things created by these incredible bands that emerged in the 60s. And as much as all the fusion musicians would have been listening to other bands, I'm sure people were watching this going, yeah, but they would have got that from this. And what about The Who? What about the Rolling Stones? What about the Grateful Dead? What about Jefferson Airplane? What about Crosby, Stills and Nash? You know, what about, you know, all these bands that were also the thing that fusion was fusing with, but the biggest single influence on of all of those bands is perhaps the Beatles. The Beatles' influence on music is overarching, and the reason is because they were so hugely commercially successful that they had a huge effect not only on music but on the culture itself. So there's my argument for you. I hope that's been entertaining and informative. I'm now going to do a video, I think, about Ringo. I think he needs a video, and I'm going to do right now. So that will be following on the way very soon. Okay, so obviously like, subscribe, and if you're loving what I'm doing, hit the Patreon because that really supports this channel. Thanks for listening and watching again.